Hey, neighbor, hey. I am Winnie Wilkinson, and I invite you to join my live talk show in St. Albans, Vermont, for candid conversations about our community, including its strengths and weaknesses, with opportunities to call in. Hi, good morning. This is Winnie Wilkinson, and we are at Hey Neighbor Hey, and our guest today is the fabulous Miss Heather Digby, and we're going to talk about housing today and the pros and cons, or the positives and negatives of from the landlord's point of view as well as the tenant's point of view. And Heather is an expert in both sides of that coin. So please listen to the facts and information that Heather will have to give to us today.
Well, hello. So I'm Heather Kelly. I'm a local real estate agent. I also own a property management company, primarily connecting tenants with landlords that have vacancies, and just trying to help get housing for folks.
And what is the process in that?
So generally, when a landlord has a vacant apartment, they'll reach out to me. I'll do the full process of advertising, marketing, doing showings, finding the perfect applicant, doing the move-in lease agreement, and then generally hand it right back over to the landlord. So they're the ones that stay in contact with the tenant if they have any issues for maintenance or payment issues. So it's a pretty simple process, but we definitely have more people looking for rentals than we have rentals available.
And do you find that that like the young professionals that are coming into St. Albans, do you find that it is easy for them to find an apartment more than a person who's looking for an affordable rental apartment?
So the kind of what we call the missing middle is really the hardest apartment to find. So somebody who has, income, a decent job, has decent credit, they tend to have the hardest time finding a decent home to rent. I sometimes make the comment that it's easier for me to help somebody buy a home than it is to find a rental. There tends to be a lot of options for folks looking for senior living, and there tends to be more options for folks looking for low income housing. But the kind of market rate, general housing, we have a really huge lack of those units available.
And so, in your opinion, would you say that seeing that there is a lack of rental apartments, that there's a good supply of homes to be purchased, or condos or co-ops to be purchased?
There's definitely more available and more coming available for purchase. Vermont tends to have a lot of really large homes. So if you're a single professional and you're looking for a 1 or 2 bedroom condo or a small home that doesn't need a lot of work, those are pretty few and far between. There aren't a lot of people looking for the large 3 and 4 bedroom homes. And a lot of the smaller homes that were used as rentals for years, when a seller could make a good profit during the COVID years, they just sold them. So those rentals of the single family home kind of disappeared. I see very, very few of them. The duplexes and triplexes, those are still available. Even those, a lot of folks bought them as investment properties, but they live in part of it. So the owner occupant situation happens quite often. So people buying homes obviously took a lot of the rentals off of the market as well. But most folks aren't really looking or can't afford to buy those large homes that we see come open the most.
Yes, and so in that situation, how would you assess the market? What is the need in the market at this point?
That's a complicated question. I think most people want an easy answer. What we truly need is a little bit of everything. We need transitional housing. We need small apartments. We need large apartments. We need small homes to buy. We need, a lot of the in between. So it's hard to just build one community that's going to help in one section where we really need a lot of things. A lot of elderly folks are staying in their homes longer, which means those homes aren't coming available for young families to buy. But again, there's really nowhere for anybody to go, so that movement has stopped. Folks can't buy their first home if folks in their first home can't buy their next home or their forever home. So we really need a lot of things to fill those gaps before we're really going to see a difference in how much we struggle with housing in Vermont.
And how long do you think that that process of having adequate housing for both sides of the situation, for the senior person that may want to downsize but can't afford to downsize, and a younger family who would like to purchase their first home? How long do you think, from your
The building cycle, how long it takes for things to physically, be built is probably a couple of years. One of the things that I notice is we do a lot of surveys. We spend a lot of time looking into what the solution could be instead of just trying to make a quick solution. So what could take 2 or 3 years probably will take 10 to 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so would you consider the housing situation an emergency situation at this point?
Oh, most definitely. And we see it with the unhoused population, but I think we also don't see it as publicly with just family members that are living on someone's couch, folks that are living in their car, folks that are finding a place indoors to sleep, but they don't have adequate housing. Folks that can't move out of their parents' home, folks that have to move out of state because they can't find anything, folks who can't take a job, a really great job that might be offered to them here in the area because they can't find housing. I try to work with some of the local employers, the corrections facility, the hospital, and they'll give offer letters to people with great jobs, and it can take months sometimes for them to find an actual place to rent, and most of the time they just have to not accept that job. So it's really just a vicious cycle that affects more things than just housing, but the average citizen doesn't see those issues. They just see the unhoused population and how that's affecting them. But anyone who provides any type of service can tell you the number of folks in need is just growing and growing.
Right. And so if we should come up with a plan, which we're at this point, in my opinion, we're specialized in having these research and having these plans, because obviously the plans that we have is not adequate for what is happening now. So we need to do a new research. And if we should do new research in terms of the different levels of needs in the community, what would be your suggestions?
I don't necessarily think that any more research is needed. I think you look at the size of your community and you build or provide all of the services that are needed to the scale that works for your community. So Franklin County or the city of St. Albans doesn't need a 300-bed shelter, but it still needs a shelter of some capacity. We don't need 1,000 homes to be built in the downtown core of St. Albans, but we need a certain number of homes. So it's not a blanket for every town, but there's definitely little things that can happen over time. One house at a time will eventually get the job done, but it's not going to do it fast enough so that the rest of the community doesn't fall apart.
Exactly, and I believe this is this whole housing crisis is a teachable moment for all of us, because we did plan pre-COVID, but then post-COVID, which is a whole different scenario of life. There seem to be no plan in sight.
Yeah, and the kind of pre-COVID into COVID plan was to kind of stop the leak. It wasn't to figure out what was causing the leak to begin with. It's not possible for us to build the number of housing units we need as quickly as we need them. So it's just going to be an ongoing battle that we have to fight. But we just need to look at what are the long-term fixes. And I think that just takes a lot of money to do, and no one really wants to say it needs to be spent. But the short-term fixes, the motel program, that wasn't going to be a long-term solution. And unfortunately, we came out of COVID and everyone is struggling. Everything is more expensive. So what we could have done, prior to COVID, we can't do that anymore.
Exactly.
Because it's, going to cost, the cost to do it. So obviously hindsight shows us that we should have done that 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But we are where we are, so we just need to slowly work on filling some of those missing pieces in the different types of housing.
And in your opinion, to help to stabilize housing with more rentals, because we have rentals on Lake Street, we have rentals on Lower Newton Street, at least what I've seen so far. And do you think that having more rentals with some affordable rentals within each building is going to address this housing situation, the housing crisis situation?
I think the more apartments, the better. If we could pretty quickly double or triple the number of rentals that we had, not only would it provide housing for folks, it would change the rental landscape. It would kind of force landlords that own properties now to reevaluate what they're charging for rentals. You can charge a higher price because there is scarcity.
Yeah.
So I don't think there would be any trouble filling those vacancies if they built more communities. I don't really think there needs to be a percentage of every building that is geared towards lower income. I think what's going to happen if you build more units is it's just going to lower prices. It's just going to make them all more affordable. I've never seen a city that is built, kind of high quality, high dollar rentals that didn't positively affect the other rentals around them. If you have a rental that's 100-year-old building and you haven't renovated it in 20 years, today you're getting top dollar. If somebody builds something newer and better, they're going to get top dollar and you'll have to reevaluate what you're renting it at. So I definitely think more. I've done the lease up of some of the newer buildings. There was a 30-unit building. I did the lease up, and I could have leased it up 3 times, full of income, kind of median income housing. So folks with, stable work. I could have leased it up 3 times with the number of folks looking.
Right.
So more, I think, is definitely needed. It's very hard to get current citizens, especially homeowners, to agree to that. NIMBY is very, very big in Vermont. People don't want things in their backyards, but we need it. So I'd love to see them building more of those larger communities.
Yes, and we do have, Vermont has more land and cows than human beings. And I find it interesting that housing is a problem in a place where there is a lot of adequate land to build houses. Right here in St. Albans, I often, driving by on Route 7, you will see, like at the back by Walmart, all that land, and and they're saying there's no place to build homes. You're going up to if you pass the hospital, you're going up the hill, going up to Fairfield, and there's a lot of land, and you're like, well, why?
And most of that is structural. So you need to have, if you have public water and sewer, it makes it much, much easier. But in some of those areas without public utilities, it is pretty easy to put in a little duplex, a triplex, 4 or 5 smaller homes. The cost to do that prohibits it from happening probably more than anything else. But totally correct, around Walmart, and it may be zoned commercial, but, obviously we know what the needs are. So there's really no reason that there isn't, in the back of that area, rentals, condos for sales, there could be mixed use housing back there. It's just whether or not a developer wants to come in and put the money down to do it.
Well, because of the need, and there are grants from HUD has grants that, well, I don't know if a private owner can apply for those, but I believe that if we use some of the especially for St. Albans, if we use some of the programs that HUD has in terms of building tiny homes for the person who wants to downsize and have like a whole senior citizen community that will have the tiny, smaller homes, that would be of great benefits as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a need for a little bit of everything, if that makes sense. So,
Yes.
I don't think we should build a community of 100 tiny homes for senior living because that would probably not fill up very quickly. But to have small communities would be more cost efficient to kind of get off the ground and to find the folks who wanted to live there.
Yes, and there are perfect examples of that. For example, right in New Hampshire, there's an example of that. I went to Maine as well. There's another example of that. So we have to, in my opinion, think outside of the box in terms of filling this emergency housing crisis and be a model for other places within the country, because we are still number 3 in housing.
I
The
see
housing
I
crisis?
see different numbers all the time, but either way, I feel like Vermont shouldn't show up on any list.
Exactly.
We should be with such a small population, we should be able to figure it out without
Without being
on
on
lists.
on
Yeah,
the list.
yeah.
On the list. I was totally alarmed when I saw that as well. The last time I checked, which was like 2 weeks or so ago, we were number 2 behind California. And we were at 42. And there's this myth that the homeless crisis in Vermont is because of people moving in.
Yes.
And what are your opinions on that?
I have tried to do my research. It doesn't seem as though there is a lot of facts. Personally, I can't imagine being homeless. I can't imagine choosing Vermont to be the place where I was going to not have a home. There are a lot of places that offer services. So I'm originally from Florida. I would not leave Florida to come
To
to
the cold.
Vermont if I was gonna not be sure where I was gonna be living. There isn't really anything that shows that that's true. I think when people say, and I've heard several people say, 5 years ago, if you saw somebody who was unhoused, you recognized them. And today they don't recognize them, so they must be from somewhere else. And what I see is they are from somewhere else. They're from Richard, they're from Enosburg, they're from Bakersfield. So they're coming to St. Albans because we have services that those towns don't have, but they're still part of our community. They're still from Franklin County, they're still from Vermont. Maybe there's somebody who left to go somewhere else and they've come back because they have roots here in Vermont, they have family here in Vermont. So I think either way, somebody shouldn't be given a chance to find housing because they're not from Vermont or they're not from St. Albans. The nativism has always been very confusing to me. I've been here for about 10 years now and will never be considered a Vermonter. So I can't imagine if I had something happen and needed assistance that I wouldn't be given it because I wasn't born here. So.
Exactly, because I'm here for 23 years, and some people will still be like, "Where you come from? Heaven?"
Yeah. Yeah, the nativism is an odd thing to have when so many Vermonters leave Vermont to go somewhere else. And I look on my Facebook pages from my hometown and they say the same things, like, who are these people coming from other states? So it's strange that so many people do leave the state for the winter, 5, 6 months at a time, but still feel as though people that aren't from here are less than for some reason.
Right, right. So, well, we are coming down to 2024. We just 1 month away from 2025. What do you see housing being in 2025?
I wish I knew. One, I do think to buy a home will hopefully become a little easier. I work with a lot of first-time home buyers now. There's a lot of programs to help folks get into a home with down payment assistance, with closing cost assistance. So there's a lot of programs on that side. My hope is that some of these new communities in St. Albans will open up and start taking applications. I think Lake Street is set to start having move-ins in January, if I'm not mistaken. So hopefully that will start the ball rolling. Unfortunately, it can't end there. It's gotta keep going. We need a lot more to happen for it to really get a lot better.
How many apartments is on the Lake Street?
I believe it's
building.
80 some units.
And how many homeless people they have?
Oh, I am not sure of that number. I'm not sure if anyone is sure of that number.
Exactly, and this is the post-COVID. There should have been a more planning given. However, but everyone will say, "Oh, but we have an apartment coming up on Lake Street, 80 apartments. What is the list?" The last time I checked, some waiting list is 3 years old. And again, if you are getting if you're on a fixed income, and someone is coming in, for example, that is a pharmacist, obviously the pharmacist will get the apartment before the person who is on fixed income get that apartment, because that person is a professional that is going to contribute tax dollars into St. Albans. So where do we go? Is my, it's like, are we going to go through 2025 with no plans again?
Well, and there are sometimes plans, but what generally I don't see happening is the plans turning into
Reality.
So I give out a lot of advice on how to find a rental. The lists that are sometimes 3 years long, I recommend, if you are in need of housing now or think that you will be soon, get on every list you can get on. The lists are not typically as long as they seem. If there's 100 people in front of you, by time a rental comes open, some of those folks have found a place, or maybe they don't qualify for the housing that's open, or maybe they just don't need it anymore. So sometimes the lists seem a little bit worse than they are.
Yeah, giant.
I also find that a lot of private landlords do not publicly list their rentals. The process you go through when you list a rental, whether you put a sign in your front yard or you put it on Facebook, can be overwhelming as a landlord, especially most landlords have a full-time job and families. So the amount of time it takes to weed through the phone calls, if you post it on Facebook, it's probably a lot of negative comments. So a lot of landlords don't publicly post them at all. So I've recommended to a few folks, make a nice little wanted ad and put it on Facebook with, some information about yourself and what you're looking for. And sometimes landlords will reach out to you directly. I've had a few folks say they've had good results doing that. But there are rentals out there. Some landlords are just allowing them to sit vacant because they've had a bad experience with being a landlord previously. So that's where I try to come in and help them so that it's not quite so challenging for them to do that.
But okay, do you think that with a landlord-tenant relationship, that not all times is the tenant that has a problem, but the landlord instead?
What type of problem?
Problem in terms of their perception of what their role should be as a landlord.
Yeah, I try to give the advice to landlords that it has to be a business transaction. And Vermont statutes are very complicated. They don't necessarily follow common sense, and there are a lot of things that a landlord needs to do from the very beginning to the very end. And most landlords that own one or two rental properties do not understand what those processes are. So to have a property manager is really, really important. You don't really need anybody to do full ongoing management, but somebody to just help you figure out what you need to do. It can be very costly if you skip some of those steps. So a landlord actually treating it as a business will have much better results. And it's better for the landlord and it's better for the tenant. If it gets too personal, it can get tricky.
All right. And do you believe that part of, well, I know that you do rental management, that in any transaction, and this is from my banking experience, is a meeting of the minds. So I believe that both landlord and tenant should have a meeting of the mind of what are the expectations from both parties.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. The lease agreement that you sign with your landlord is generally pretty detailed. But it also has very specific things and very specific wording that needs to be in there. But to meet with the person moving into the rental, for them to meet the landlord, to have that connection, to have that comfort to be able to call your landlord when something goes wrong. As a landlord, you want your tenants to let you know when there's an issue, whether it's a maintenance issue or they feel like they're going to have an issue paying the next month's rent. That open line of communication makes a huge difference. But it's important from both sides.
And I want to talk about, because in this housing crisis, you find that, and this is just my opinion, my observation from being in the community, if you are living in an apartment, say 9, 10 years, that apartment now is like $800 more if the landlord puts a new tenant in there. And some landlords are actually creating drama for a tenant, and then the next thing you know, there's this fight after the person was living there for such a long time, and then they rent it for like $2,800 more.
And so I've been in property management for over 20 years. That was my background before I moved to Vermont. And if you have a landlord, or if you are the landlord that doesn't do an annual rental increase, you're not doing anybody any favors. So the cost of living goes up every day. So as a landlord, if you haven't raised your tenant's rent every year, you probably don't have reserves when something goes wrong. So if you're still charging 1994 rates for an apartment and the roof caves in, you probably don't have the money set aside to fix a roof. And that really doesn't benefit the tenant or the landlord. So my advice is to always do a small increase every year, keep them at market rate or close to market rate. But totally true. If somebody new comes in and buys a building, they're paying today's rates to buy that building.
Right.
So they have to increase your rate to market rate to be able to make their mortgage payment. So it's a catch-22. Landlords try to be nice because they like their tenants, but it just puts everyone in a bad spot.
Yes. So, well, I guess 2025 is right around the corner, and we still having this discussion post-COVID, and this is going to be our second year post-COVID, and we still having a conversation about how to make adjustments for housing so that we don't have an emergency housing in 2025. But apparently, we are going into 2025 with still an emergency housing and no plan in sight. I want to thank you,
Yes, thank you for
Heather,
having me.
Kelly, for being here. I believe that this conversation was a needed conversation. Um, and I'm sure that when we upload this video, we're going to have more conversations and more questions concerning it. And I'll know that you will be graciously be there to answer questions concerning that. And thank you for looking at us. This is Winnie Wilkinson from Hey Neighbor Hey. And thank you once again.